talking. Tonight's story is probably one of the most terrifying and horrendous ordeals and accounts of a dogman encounter, plus many other strange and peculiar occurrences. I'm sure you guys will definitely agree. You may have heard part of this story already about a month back on Vic Condiff's show Dogman Encounters Radio, episode 168, sent in by Rick. And I spoke to Rick shortly after that episode went out. Rick contacted me and explained there was a lot more to the story that he wanted to get across and felt had a definite connection to his dogman encounter. Guys, this really sort of rocked my world in terms of what I believe in and what to keep my mind open in things, especially within the genre that we deal with. Please do let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, please do like and share. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's story. I'd like to entitle, I left Florida to get away from vampires and witches, only to run into a werewolf in Kentucky. Let's get straight into that. Hey DMT, I must apologise for the delay in my getting back to you about my encounter with the dogman and the highest strangeness that preceded it. I gave an account of my encounter to Vic Condiff on Dogman Encounters Radio, episode 168, but was not able to give a full account of the strange incidents that occurred prior to my actual dogman encounter, and thought perhaps maybe you could convey them for me on your show. Anyone who wants to hear the actual encounter itself can do so by going onto YouTube and looking up Vic's show, Dogman Encounters. My name is Rick, and episode 168 will be my encounter, and it covers pretty much all of it. However, I honestly believe that my dogman encounter is tied directly to incidents that occurred during and after the murder trial I was a juror for. I believe something supernatural was going on here. This case was pretty famous at the time and made national news as well. Shortly after it ended, a book about the case was written by the crime author Aphrodite Jones. Miss Jones also has a TV show on True TV that used to be Court TV. The name of her book on the case was called The Embrace. Anyone curious about it can read her account of it and the trial. I was juror number 11, and I have truly come to regret it. You can find the book on Amazon.com. I'll let you be the judge as to whether curses or spells actually work. This, however, is my story, and I will swear on my family's lives that every single word of it is true. In late January of 1998, I was impanelled on a jury for a double murder trial that was to take place in my very small hometown in central Florida. My job at the time, a software engineer in a telecommunications company, required me to travel all over the world for months at a time, and I was not in my hometown when this double murder occurred. Therefore, I was unaware of it even happening. So, apparently what happened was this young high school boy named Rod, and I do not want to give his full name, moved down with his mother, a self-proclaimed witch, to my small hometown in central Florida from Owensboro, Kentucky. Once enrolled in a local high school, Rod began to recruit some of the local teens from it into a vampire cult he had begun to take part of when he was a high school student in Kentucky. There, in Kentucky, he was embraced by the group's leader, a young man who went by the vampire name of Jaden. In this new local group, Rod was considered the leader. These teens would meet in a local cemetery where they would conduct an initiation of the newest members. The initiations consisted of slicing one another's arms and drinking one another's blood. The group called this initiation the Embrace. Over time, Rod recruited several local teens into his group, and also associated the group with several other local groups that dabbled in dark arts such as witches and Satan worshippers. These groups would often meet together on Friday nights and read from the Necronomicon, a book of unholy arts, witchcraft and spells. Rod's own mother was involved with combined meetings, as well as these meetings included adults as well as the local teens. Allegedly, during these combined meetings, Satan worship was practiced, spells were cast, and all manner of sexual perversion and promiscuity occurred as well. This would include incest, group sex, bestiality, and statutory rape. Enter into this situation a very young and impressionable little girl that, like many confused young teens, was detached from her parents and sadly was not happy at home. She was always feeling unappreciated and unloved and had little communication with them. The young girl, named Heather, made several attempts to run away from home only to be subsequently caught and brought back. There she would face the usual teenager's punishments of being grounded and several privileges taken away. This angered Rod, since he no longer considered Heather as belonging to her parents, but belonging to him. This was a very deep-seated delusion with this young man. He truly felt that he now owned and controlled this young girl. When her parents decided that Heather was no longer allowed to have any contact at all with Rod, he grew even more angry and desperate. At first, Rod cast spells to harm the parents, but local white witches found out and got angered by it. So, Rod decided that he would try a different method of getting Heather away from her parents' control. He then decided he would just go and take her. Rod gathered his vampire group together and hatched a plan to go take Heather from her parents' home, as well as steal their vehicle and money. The group would then drive the parents' vehicle out west to one of America's largest national forests. It is believed Yellowstone, where they would begin a commune of sorts and live off the land undetected by law enforcement or any outside people. On the night of the murders, most of the children involved with the plan got cold feet and backed out, deciding not to go along with Rod. In the end, only 5 would go along. Only one other member, named Scott, would actually participate in the actual murders. The other participants were Heather and 2 other local teen girls. This lack of support from his followers further angered Rod even more. In order to get Heather away from her parents, Rod and Scott went to her home around 10 p.m. on a Friday night. Heather had an older sister, a senior at the same high school, who had just that day received the good news that she had been accepted to a Florida State University for the following fall term. The older sister was out with friends celebrating the news of her college acceptance. How extremely fortunate for her. Heather, who would have been grounded for weeks, had finally been allowed to spend the night with a friend family knew and trusted. It was her birthday, and letting Heather stay the night was a favour from the parents for her. She would later that night sneak away from her friend's home to join Rod and the rest. This left the parents alone in their home when Rod and Scott approached it on that fateful Friday night. The two stood outside the home for a while, contemplating what they were about to do. Scott was having second thoughts. Rod grew more angry. He quickly admonished Scott and assured him he had it all planned out. Rod held in his hand a stick about 2 feet long, painted black with a black tape grip. This would be his weapon of choice. Looking around the home for an easy place to enter, Rod first tried the window to Heather's room. It was locked. The duo then went around to the other side of the home, where they found the side door into the garage to be unlocked. This gave the entrance into the garage. Halfway home, Rob muttered. As the two would-be murderers entered the garage, they began to look around. There, on a small workbench, lay something that caught Rod's eye and made him smile. Perfect, he whispered intensely as he reached over and picked up a 1.5 foot long solid steel crowbar-type tool, known to construction workers as a cat claw. He grasped the cat claw firmly and handed the stick he had been holding to Scott for his use. The two then quietly made their way to the door that led into the home, and Rod began to slowly turn the knob. It was not locked. They could hear a TV on the other side. The sounds of a local newscaster's voice were on it. It must have been 11 p.m, thought Rod. We'd better hurry, he whispered to Scott. As he turned the knob fully, Rod began to slowly open the door. Inside, he could see the side of the sofa. A large figure was laying on it in the family's living room. From where they were, the two of them could see that no one else was in the living room except the figure on the sofa. So, they entered slowly and carefully. Quietly, the two approached the sofa, where they could now tell the figure of Heather's father was lying there fast asleep. Rod casually walked over next to the sleeping man, with the TV drowning out any noise he might have made. Scott then smiled and began to giggle under his breath as Rod danced like it was some kind of faintly silly Indian rain dance next to the sleeping man on the sofa. Scott then walked to the end of the sofa where the man's head lay. Rod had stopped his dancing now. They both leered at this man, who was the cause of all their grief. This sleeping man who had denied Rod his right. He had denied Rod what was his. Heather no longer belonged to this man. Heather belonged to him. Scott looked at the man with disdain. This man who had angered his leader so much seemed harmless while he slept. This man who, in a moment, would no longer sleep, no longer dream, no longer smile, laugh, talk, or anger his master. This sleeping man, who soon would no longer breathe, made him sick. Rod raised the cat claw above his head and came down quickly with it, then stopped, just inches above the sleeping man's head. He feigned another blow, then another, and another, till he finally looked Scott in his eyes, with the blood boiling in his own red, and Rod yelled into almost scream-like, "Fuck it!" With that, Rod had raised the cat claw again high into the air above the head and came down with a bone-crunching blow right into the middle forehead of Heather's father. The first blow shocked Scott into reality. Rod was committing murder and he was part of it. Rob continued to land bone-crunching blow after bone-crunching blow, and the blood flew everywhere. Scott decided he better act too, and Rod would be angry, so he raised the wooden baton he held and came down on the man's skull as well. The feel of the wood hitting the mashed-in goo that was now this man's face was almost sickening to Scott, but Rod didn't seem to care. He continued to pummel the man's skull, while Scott watched a tooth go flying across the room. Both young men laughed at the sight, and it seemed to bring Rod back out of whatever demonic spell had taken over his mind in the last few seconds. They looked down at this matted, smashed-up skull that had once been a man's face. They stared at the blood and brain matter splattered on the sofa and surrounding walls. As the duo surveyed their handiwork, Rod exclaimed, "Holy shit, that dude is mincemeat." With that, the two of them laughed evilly. Rod then looked at Scott more businesslike and said, "Find the car keys and I'll get these wallets." As Rod procured the now very dead man's wallet, Scott ventured towards the kitchen, looking for a key hook where Heather told him to find the keys to her parents' Ford Explorer. Just before reaching the doorway to the kitchen, Scott froze. Rod, having grabbed the wallet, came to his side. "What is it?" he asked. "Someone is coming from the kitchen," Scott whispered. Rod eased to the doorway by the kitchen with the cat claw in hand. He could hear someone pouring a cup of coffee and mixing it up. Sugar, then cream. It was Heather's mum, fresh from her nightly shower. Heather's mum had actually been her biggest complaint. Her father was working all the time, so her mum was the one who would usually be home and refused to allow her to see or speak to Rod. For that, she must pay, thought Rod. The anger and the adrenaline poured into his veins and his eyes burned with hatred. It felt good. He turned around and looked at Scott and motioned around the corner to the kitchen. With that, Rod eased around the corner too. There, he could see, standing in front of him, the back of a woman in a light blue terry cloth bathrobe with wet hair dangling down her back. She was mixing a cup of coffee on the counter as he and Scott slowly crept up behind her. When the two killers were about 3 feet away from Heather's mum, she turned around and an instant horror-filled look covered her face at the sight of the two black-cloaked teenage boys in front of her. Their faces were indeed covered in blood. Fear gripped her instantly as she recognised them both. "Get out!" she screamed at Rod as she threw the hot cup of coffee into his face and turned to run away. Rod yelled in pain as the hot coffee burned his eyes, and he reached out and grabbed at the blue terry cloth bathrobe. The screaming woman ripped free from the bathrobe as her naked body flashed across the kitchen. Scott grabbed her wet hair as Rod regained his senses. Together, the two of them overpowered the naked woman and threw her to the floor, face down. They sat atop of her body and began to beat her in the back of the skull with their instruments of murder. The screaming silenced as urine poured from between the naked woman's legs. Blow after blow crushed in the back of the naked woman's skull, while blood and brain matter went flying everywhere. "This bitch will never throw a coffee on me again," thought Rod angrily. His fury was even more intense than before. This time, he beat his victim so badly, he dislodged her brain from the brainstem and caused it to spin sideways in her skull. Finally, Rod had enough. He stood up along with Scott, who had held the naked woman to the floor. They marvelled at their handiwork lying naked on the floor in a pool of her own blood and brain matter. "Nice body for an old chick," observed Rod. With that, and using the toe of his black combat boot, he began to try and turn the dead woman's body over, so Scott reached down and grabbed a lifeless arm to help. The two pulled the naked woman's body over and had a good look. With a disgusting half grin and snicker, Scott said, "Not bad at all." With that vile comment, the two killers laughed aloud and resumed their look for the truck keys. Upon locating the wall hook, they found the keys Heather had told them about. The killers then surveyed the final scene. "Whoa, what a mess!" exclaimed Rod. Having completed the task at hand, the killers quickly grabbed Mum's purse and headed into the garage. They opened the door and climbed into the truck, Rod driving back out slowly. "Mission accomplished," he said to Scott. They then stopped outside to use the water hose to wash the blood off of everything they could see it on. When the two of them felt they were clean enough, they hopped back into the truck and drove away from this house of horrors that they had created. Half an hour later, Heather's older sister would return home. Still glowing from her acceptance party, she figured she would sit up with Mum and watch The Tonight Show while Dad snored away on the sofa like he always did. Upon entering the home, she could see that Dad was on the sofa, but Mum wasn't in the room. As she headed to the kitchen, something caught her eye that sent chills down her spine. A bloody footprint. This is the recount given by several witnesses to a murder trial that I was juror for. Juror number 11 specifically. The crimes were committed in 1996 and the trial took place in early 1998. It was very shortly after this trial that I had a horrifying Dogman encounter. I shared the actual Dogman encounter on Vic Condiff's show, episode 168, a few weeks ago, and even touched on the murder trial. I was on that preceded it. I had many requests to give more details on the case and how it led up to my encounter. As I said on Vic's show, after witnessing the brutality and evilness of these murders, I needed some time to get away. I wound up going on a fishing trip in the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. A trip I would come to regret for the rest of my life. During this trial, I bore witness to some extremely troubling testimonies from numerous teenage children from our local high school, as well as the murderer's mother. These little girls, who were into witchcraft, Satan worship, ritual sex and blood sacrifices, casting spells from the Necronomicon book of witchcraft, and actual blood drinking, saddened me. This was extremely disturbing and shocking to me to find out it was going on in my very small hometown which I grew up in. I never in a million years suspected this to be going on here. The jury was subjected to this horrible testimony, videos and pictures to go along with it for 3 weeks, all while being glared at with the most evil stare by Rod's mother, herself a proclaimed witch. After the trial ended and we delivered a guilty verdict, and because we saw Rod as just as big a threat to fellow prisoners as innocent people on the outside, the verdict we handed down came with a unanimous death sentence recommendation. It was later commuted to a life in prison by our state Supreme Court on the grounds he was too young at the time he committed the murders to be put to death. But as the sentence was handed down, his mother yelled a curse or spell of some sort in Latin at the jury, prosecutor and the judge. I know it sounds like something straight from the Twilight Zone, and I do not know if the curse had anything to do with my encounter or not. But I do find it very coincidental that my encounter was in Kentucky, where this young man and his mother came from. I know the judge also passed away unexpectedly very soon after, and the state attorney that prosecuted him was arrested himself and resigned in disgrace. As for my fellow jurors, I cannot say, because we did not stay in touch. For me, I can say that after my encounter, I was almost killed by a falling soda machine shortly afterwards, and was forced to stop working and semi-retire. The machine falling on me broke my back in 2 places and crushed my right side ribs and both of my hips, which had to be replaced. It collapsed 1 lung and fractured my pelvis in 3 places. I spent 6 months in bed, followed by 2 years in a wheelchair and another 5 years with a walker and crutches, learning to walk again. Shortly after I was able to walk well enough to get around on my own, I had a massive heart attack and was rushed in for emergency quadruple bypass surgery, all before my 50th birthday. So, I don't know if her curse or spell had any effect or not. I'll let you people decide. I do know this: a fiction writer could not come up with a story this good, yet every single word I have just told you is 100% true, and I would swear on the lives of my family that it is. The trial for Rod, the leader of the vampire cult, ended in mid-February. For many days afterward, I continued to think about the horrible things I had witnessed during the trial. Seeing such graphic and awful acts in detail and realising that this was going on in my hometown, I became very, very depressed and sad. To know that young children had been involved in witchcraft, Satan worship and cold-blooded murder in this little town that I had grown up in and loved was very hard for me to believe. I didn't think much about what the young man's mother had said to us all, since I didn't understand her and didn't believe in supernatural things like curses, spells or hexes anyway. Right around that time, my aunt, who was my mother's youngest sister, was down from her home in Lexington, Kentucky, along with her husband, who was my uncle, visiting our family. My uncle had been a long-time companion to my father, and when I went hunting and fishing also. From the time I was a small child, I had always been an avid outdoorsman, hunting, fishing, hiking and camping, and just generally exploring out in the woods near my home in central Florida. I spent about half of my childhood in the woods, so I had come to know them extremely well. My uncle had accompanied my father and I on many hunting and fishing trips in the woods, so when he invited me to accompany him on a fishing trip he had planned for the second week of March, I jumped at the invitation. My wife and I both thought it would be a great way to get away from home and relax and enjoy nature while just forgetting all about that horrible trial and everything I had seen and heard. And since I had plenty of vacation time, getting the time off to go was no problem at all. So, when they got ready to head home a couple of weeks later, I packed up all my gear and a couple of guns and kissed my wife goodbye. We left Central Florida early on Saturday morning, with me following their truck up in my car. We headed first to his home in Lexington, so he could pack his fishing gear and all of his camping supplies, as well as his own firearms. We weren't doing any hunting, but we brought the guns along with us because he said there were bear in the area we were going to, and it was better to be safe than sorry. We loaded the guns and all of our camping and fishing gear into his truck and prepared to leave for the Daniel Boone National Forest in southeast Kentucky the next morning. We woke the next day in no hurry, taking our time to be sure we had everything we needed for a full week out in the forest, because where we were going to be was way too far out in the middle of nowhere to go back to a store for supplies. We did a little last minute shopping and then said goodbye to my aunt as we both jumped into his truck for the long drive out into the Daniel Boone National Forest. The place we were headed to was a very large tension power line easement that cut through the very dense forest of southern Kentucky. We were planning on camping on a bluff that overlooked the banks of the Rockcastle River, about 2 miles north of where it joins up with the Cumberland River, which is a very large river that comes down from the Appalachian Mountains and snakes through southern Kentucky. Our plan was to set up camp atop the bluff there that was some 30 feet above the banks of the Rockcastle and carry our gear down to the river via a trail that wound down from above to the shoreline. The Rockcastle River is very popular for whitewater kayaking. My uncle's family liked to get out on the river in early spring just after the melt started and before the kayakers had a chance to crowd the waterways. The smallmouth bass are supposed to be really good at that time of year as well, so it seemed like the perfect fishing opportunity for me to just fish, camp and enjoy nature. By the time we arrived at our spot on the bluff there, it was dark, so we decided just to sleep in the truck till the sun came up, then get our gear out and head down the trail to the shoreline to fish. We figured we could set up the tent later in the morning after everything was dry from the morning dew. This was a fortunate idea for us. We awoke early the next morning and got ready to head down to the shoreline. When I stepped out of the truck, I realised it was still very cold in Kentucky in early March, unlike Florida where spring break was well underway at the beaches for the college kids. There was no wind to speak of, but still I found it very odd, that even though the sun was starting to rise, there was no sound coming from the forest. No birds chirping or bugs buzzing about. Nothing. The woods around us were as silent as a church prayer group. All I could hear was the water moving in the river down below, a buzz in the power lines, and my uncle grabbing his gear from the back of the truck. I joined in and grabbed my fishing gear and my guns as well as a collapsible chair and cooler. As far as firepower, we both felt what we had was more than sufficient. I carried a 30-06 rifle with a 4x14 scope and a 357 Magnum sidearm. My uncle carried a 12-gauge shotgun with 000 buckshot and a 4.4 Magnum sidearm. A hand cannon is what I call it. So, all the time I was getting my stuff from the truck, I kept having this feeling of being watched. After 8 years in the army with the 82nd Airborne and after 3 tours of combat, I had begun to develop a third eye in the back of my head that alerted me to danger. I should have listened, but I shook off the feeling of being watched, and since we were loaded for bear, my uncle and I set off down the trail toward the shoreline of the Rockcastle. When we arrived on the shore, I sat down the cooler and my fishing gear and set up my folding chair. He set his chair next to mine with a bait bucket and then walked around behind me. It was at that moment I heard the first limb break. We both froze as we began to hear the sound of something in the woodline behind us. We were sitting on the shoreline with the bluff and trail down. It's situated behind us just a bit to our right. This is where the power lines crossed over the Rockcastle. We didn't want to sit under those buzzing power lines, so we set our chairs just a few yards down shore south. The noises coming from the woodline were further south of us, another 40 or 50 yards or so. Whatever was making the noise sounded big, and worse yet, it sounded bipedal. I sat completely motionless with my fishing rod in hand and rifle leaning next to me. I could not see my uncle at this time because he was still behind me. He too was standing still as a statue, not saying a word. We listened for what seemed like several minutes, but was more like a few seconds, to the sound of something breaking limbs, big limbs, and crunching in the underbrush, when all of a sudden this enormously huge and petrifying beast sprang out of the tree line and onto the shore about 40 yards south of where we had started fishing. It looked like a werewolf. This thing was jet black from head to toe, with a massive sized head and two glaring yellow eyes. It had long pointed ears on top of its head, with little tufts of fur on top like a bobcat has. The snout was long, but also full and wide, and it had a mouth full of massive teeth that were all sharp and pointed, not just the canines. It had a thick neck that came down to what looked like either longer hair on its back and shoulders, or it was raised up. The shoulders were pronounced cannonball type shoulders that went into very muscular arms. These were extremely long compared to a human. The arms continued down to what looked like oversized raccoon hands with claws on each and every finger that had to be over an inch long. Its torso looked human and had incredible muscular definition like a bodybuilder has. It then narrowed a bit at the waist and continued down into its legs, which has some very, very muscular thighs and human-like knees. The legs then went down to hocks, or the backward bent legs of a dog or wolf, and then ended at huge sized dog type feet. I was completely frozen in place. I just sat there in stunned silence as I tried to wrap my mind around what I was seeing. At first, I thought it was a bear, but quickly ruled that out. I had a million things going through my mind at once. What the hell was this thing? Where the hell did it come from? And how the hell can I get away from it? Where some of my thoughts, at that moment, I caught a whiff of the thing, and oh my God, did it stink. It had the most rancid smell I have ever smelled of an animal. It smelled like 3-day-old roadkill that had been rotting in a hot Florida sun. Just an unbelievably nauseating stink to it. I thought about my family, my wife, my son who would never see me again. I knew we were dead men. It then leaned over and laid its ears back on its head and squinted its eyes like it was about to pounce. Then it growled. This growl was so sinister and so pronounced it literally vibrated my entire body all the way down to my soul. It was horrifying. I nearly peed my pants. Right at that moment I heard an incredibly loud boom over my head that shook me free from my frozen state of fear that I was in. My uncle, who was still standing right behind me, had pulled out his .44 Magnum pistol and fired it over the top of that thing's head. When he did that, I almost pissed myself again, and the beast did a backwards somersault into the wood line and tore out of sight in a flash. We both immediately grabbed our poles and guns and hauled ass up the trail of the bluff. Hands over feet, we dug and scraped and scrambled our way up the trail towards the truck, dirt flying and dust in our faces, while we were praying aloud for God to protect us. Once we reached the truck, we opened the doors and just threw our guns in the back seat. My uncle started the truck and took off foot to the floor. As soon as we took off, that creature burst out the wood line on the other side of the power lines. It gave chase as we flew down the 2-rut maintenance road by the power lines, and it stayed right on our bumper. This thing was so big on all fours, its head was over the bed of the truck, and I could see it snarling. It stayed with us till we made it to a paved road, and my uncle took off. By this time, I was getting physically ill and was about to throw up. This thing stayed with that truck till we reached every bit of 60 miles per hour. It then broke off its chase and darted back into the woods. I rolled down my window, stuck my head out and vomited right there. I threw up a couple more times before we got out of the heavily wooded area. All the way back home, my uncle and I could not even talk about what we had just seen. We just sat and rode in stunned silence. When we pulled into the driveway at his home in Lexington, I grabbed all my belongings, tossed them into my car, and left right away for Florida. I drove non-stop all the way home. I only stopped for gas. As I drove home, I went over it in my mind again and again. What the hell had we seen out there? And where the hell did it come from? I also thought about the irony of how I left Florida to get away from vampires and witches, only to run into a werewolf in Kentucky. It was only much later that it occurred to me that the young man I had been a juror for was from Kentucky, and what his mother had said to us as she left the courtroom following our verdict. Was it a curse? I don't know. Is that the reason for my misfortunes? I don't know the answer to that either. It all seems very, very coincidental to me. But I'll let you decide. Do you believe in curses, spells, or hexes? Thank you for listening. Rick. Wow. Thank you so much, Rick, for sharing that with us and trusting me with that horrendous experience of yours, but nonetheless an absolutely incredible story. Guys, please do let us know down below what you thought in the comments. Please do like and share. And remember, guys, if you're going on a fishing trip, best to check the location history first, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.